Many stories of history focus on massive armies clashing to decide the fate of empires. But the individuals who broke the grip of absolute power in ancient Egypt held no official rank. Two ordinary women, armed with nothing but their convictions, outmaneuvered the most ruthless dictator of their age. Generations earlier, the Israelites had earned a secure place in Egypt. Joseph, a Hebrew, had rescued the empire from a devastating famine through a massive system of grain consolidation, storing surpluses to prevent economic collapse. Because of that covenant, his family settled safely in the fertile region of Goshen. Time passed, and a new pharaoh took the throne. He chose deliberate amnesia. He ignored the history of Joseph's protection and discarded the old alliances, preferring to view the growing Israelite population as targets rather than neighbors. A dictator's most effective weapon is rarely a sword. It is the authority to erase history and rewrite the national memory to justify future cruelty. The Hebrew families residing in Goshen were thriving. They built strong communities, worked hard, and their numbers grew steadily across the region. This map shows the borders of ancient Egypt, and this growing cluster of dots represents the Israelite population. Pharaoh looked at this demographic data and saw a massive security risk. He feared they could become a fifth column, insiders allying with foreign invaders. Using that perceived threat, the king launched a brutal crackdown. The Israelites were forcefully relocated, stripped of freedom, and forced into slavery. The cruelty was intensely physical. The Egyptians drove the Hebrews into the fields and construction sites under the scorching sun. They were forced to build massive store cities like Pithom and Ramesses, leaving behind mud brick ruins that stand as archaeological evidence of that agonizing labor. But the labor camps failed to achieve their primary goal. Despite the exhaustion and the whips, the Israelites continued to multiply. The harsh conditions only seemed to strengthen their resilience. Unable to work them to death, Pharaoh escalated his cruelty. He summoned two Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and handed them a horrific command. Whenever they helped deliver a Hebrew baby boy, they were ordered to quietly murder him. Authoritarian violence often begins as unchecked paranoia, hiding behind the excuse of national security, until the state demands ordinary citizens carry out its worst crimes. The work of a midwife was grueling and intimate. Shiphrah and Puah operated in dimly lit rooms, bringing life into the world among exhausted women whose bodies were already broken by slavery. Pharaoh's decree was a severe psychological violation. He demanded these women take the hands they used to heal and protect and turn them into the weapons of an assassin, killing the children at their most vulnerable moment. But the midwives made a choice. They recognized Pharaoh's authority over Egypt, but they feared the God of Israel more. They decided to reject the earthly threat and obey a higher moral law. In secret, day after day, they actively protected the newborn boys. When a son was born, they let him live, operating a quiet rebellion directly under the nose of the most dangerous man in the world. Courage is often romanticized as a charge into battle. Often it looks exactly like this: an unyielding refusal to participate in evil, especially when that evil has been made perfectly legal. It didn't take long for the secret genocide to collapse. Reports made their way back to the palace. There were still baby boys crying in the Hebrew camps. The state's plan was failing. Pharaoh summoned Shiphrah and Puah back to the throne room. Standing before an angry dictator demanding to know why his orders had been ignored, the power dynamic was entirely in his favor. They were inches from execution. When interrogated, they delivered a brilliant defense. They claimed the Hebrew women were incredibly vigorous, giving birth so quickly that the child was already delivered by the time a midwife arrived. It was a strategically flawless answer. They weaponized Pharaoh's own knowledge against him. He knew the Hebrew women were hardened by brutal physical labor, making the story entirely plausible. He couldn't disprove it without exposing his own ignorance of the slave camps. Brute tyranny is rigid and predictable. It can often be dismantled by calculated wisdom and a shrewd understanding of the oppressor's blind spots. History has a way of sorting the proud from the faithful. The most powerful dictator of the ancient world is remembered in this story simply as the king of Egypt, a nameless, faceless tyrant. Yet the names Shiphrah and Puah are immortalized. Because they risked everything to protect the families of others, the biblical account notes that God rewarded the midwives by building them households and families of their own. Their initial act of defiance allowed an entire generation to survive. Among the boys born under the shadow of Pharaoh's paranoia was a child who would eventually be drawn from the waters of the Nile. That boy was Moses, who would one day return to challenge another Pharaoh and demand his people's freedom. Isolated acts of hidden faithfulness serve as the foundational bedrock for national deliverance centuries later. The pressures Shiphrah and Puah faced echo today. We might not face a tyrant demanding murder, but modern culture issues its own decrees. It shows up as a boss demanding dishonesty to secure a deal, a corporate cover-up, or immense social pressure to abandon your core values to fit in. It is deeply human to want a faith that costs nothing. We want the approval of our peers, and we want to keep our comfortable positions, which makes it tempting to choose earthly convenience over divine obedience. But the legacy of the midwives is a direct call to stand between the vulnerable and those who would exploit them. Whether it is someone being bullied in school, ignored by a system, or entirely unable to defend themselves, the obligation remains the same. Conviction is only proven when the consequences are real. It demands that we choose truth over comfort and loyalty to God over every voice that asks us to do wrong.